Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be diving into an important topic, which is collegiate female field hockey injury rates. And we're breaking down a study that recently looked at injury rates in the NCAA over a 5-year period. So let's dive right in and have a look at some of these statistics. It can be really, really useful just to better understand what the key injury risks are, how frequently they happen, and also fundamentally what we can do about it. So this study from Nadima in 2021 was an NCAA injury surveillance program overview. So they looked at the data that gets reported in the NCAA, and this was over two different windows. They looked at 2014 to 2015 and 2018 to 2019, and two different periods of time. The key findings from the paper, I'm going to be breaking down. We're looking at the injury rates, the different types of injuries, frequency, when they happen in the season, what types of injuries, and the level of injury from D1, D2, and D3, and the impact that variety of different factors has on those things, which injury sites are most common, and then fundamentally what we can do about it as well from a strength and conditioning injury prevention perspective. So fundamentally, the headline statistic was there was 6.27 injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures. So that was the overall injury rate. Now, an athlete exposure is defined as one athlete participating in a practice or competition. So if you had an athlete doing 1,000 training sessions or matches per year, obviously it wouldn't be 1,000 matches, but like if you combined all of that together, the overall net injury risk is 6.27 injuries per 1,000 exposures. Now, I don't have direct statistics to share with you in this presentation about other sports and how it compares, but needless to say, there's still a significant risk there. And we were looking at what those injuries are and also which ones we can probably do more about and which ones we can do a little bit less about from the nature of the injury as well. But 6.27 injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures. Next up, then, we had the We had the injury rates based on competition versus practice. Interestingly, the injury rate during competition was significantly higher than during practice. The competition injury risk or rate was 10.7 per 1,000 athlete exposures, while practice injury rate was just 4.93. And you can see that in this graph here from the paper. So this black line here is competition across these different time periods, and the grey line is practice. So you can see consistently that in competition, the injury risk at the collegiate female athlete experiences are going to be higher in competition than during practice. This obviously makes sense. Naturally, the competition is going to bring about more intensity. You're playing against an opposition. There's naturally a lot more risk factors associated with competition anyway. So that's what we know. So there's more risk factors in competition than there are during practice. And they obviously looked at different time periods as well. Down here, we have the injury rate per 1,000 athlete exposures in competition and practice in different time periods as well. And again, significantly higher, although what you can see is that begins to decline across different time periods here, which is obviously a positive trend we're seeing there. So overall, competition provides more risk. In terms of body parts, the most commonly injured body parts were head and face, which accounted for about 16% of all injuries, and the thigh, which accounted for 12.3 injuries. Other injuries that we know are significant risk factors include the ankle and foot. That's a significant injury risk. The knee, so you can see here 11.6% of injuries were associated with the knee, 8.5% in the ankle and 6% in the foot. So if you combine ankle and foot together, that's obviously a significant injury risk factor. And then also hand and wrist was another significant risk factor at 11%. So interestingly, head and face, significant factor, usually because of the type of injury that they experience is usually going to be some sort of contact-based injury with the ball, stick, opposition, that type of thing. And when we come to think about injury risk prevention, from a strength and conditioning perspective, we'll have a bit of a think in a second about which ones we can probably do more about and which ones are a little bit more difficult to do things about. But overall, these are the kind of the key headline statistics. In terms of injury types, the most frequent types of injuries reported were concussions and ankle sprains. So again, we know the ankle is a significant risk factor, so that's certainly something we can do about. And concussions, again, we can do plenty of good work to help prevent concussions. Concussions were 8.6% of all injuries, but there was a noticeable decrease in concussion rates between 2017 to 2018 and 2018 to 2019. Now, we don't know exactly why, but one of the key things is obviously we're more aware of it. It's a bigger issue and we're doing things to prevent it. So we can see that the trend is going down, which is really, really positive. We obviously really want to minimize and reduce concussion as much as we possibly can do. And there's a number of things which we can help prevent this. Equipment, rules, and training are three ways in which we can go about that. So from the rules perspective, obviously there are technical rules that are in place to help to provide a safety component. Equipment for things like short corners with masks being in place, obviously very, very important. And then from a training perspective, things like neck strength exercises, and also just things like reactive agility and being able to get yourself in and out of positions quickly, so you're not putting yourself in compromised positions with the risk of being hit or that type of thing. All things we can do to help to prevent that risk of concussion, as well as things like medical interventions, nutrition interventions as well. But this isn't really the video to go into all the detail around concussion, and it's also not my area of expertise. But fundamentally, these are some of the big ones. In terms of mechanism or how these injuries occurred, equipment and apparatus, essentially, contact was the most common mechanism. So being hit with the ball, hit with the stick, hit by the goal, running into the goalpost or contact with the goalpost, that accounted for almost 30% of injuries. And this was followed by non-contact and overuse injuries. So interestingly, this in terms of the mechanism here, player contact was around the 8% mark. Equipment was around 28%, non-contact injuries 22%, overuse 18%. Now, when we think about the types of injuries that from an S&C perspective we can have more of an impact on, contact with the player, we can do something about that, because obviously the more robust and strong an athlete is, the less likely you're going to get injured if you do contact on the player. Surface contact, sometimes these can be kind of freak accidents, if you like, falling and slipping and landing. But again, we can do a bit about that. Equipment and apparatus contacts, the kind of thing which is a little bit more difficult to do things about, because the nature of hockey is it's a little bit of a chaotic sport, isn't it? And sometimes in the D, if there's a stick that contacts a player's head or torso or something like that, it's a little bit difficult to do things about that from a training and S&C perspective. But non-contact and overuse injuries, well, this is a huge area of opportunity here where we can actually try to reduce that risk of injury. So if we combine the two numbers there, we've got 40% of injuries occurred through non-contact. So that's a very, very key area which S&C can make a difference. And overuse injuries, which again, chronic-based injuries are things we can have a huge impact on from a training perspective. So 40% of injuries effectively are specifically what S&C can really do to help prevent in those areas. Now, the study also looked at the injury rates across different levels. That was D1, D2, and D3. And interestingly, the D1 had the lowest overall injury rate at 4.4 injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures, while D3 had the highest at 9.18 per 1,000 athlete exposures. So almost double the number of injuries per 1,000. What this kind of shows is a few things. There is more risk of injury at the lower levels. Interestingly, the demand will be greater at the higher levels, but also athletes might be more prepared. So that's kind of an interesting trade-off, isn't it, of the demand versus preparation sort of balance, if you like, and making sure we're striking that balance effectively. Because if you've got athletes who are playing at a high level but are more prepared, then good news, the risk of injury is lower. But if you've got athletes playing at a lower level who are less prepared, then again, the injury risk is also heightened. Again, in terms of the types of injuries, it was kind of a consistent theme really across the mechanism. So whether that was contact versus non-contact, contact with equipment or things like that. But fundamentally, that's a good thing to know, is that actually the injury risk is lower at the higher levels because of the type of player who's in that environment is probably going to be doing more to help prevent the injury risk as well. So in terms of implications, this is kind of like the key bit really, isn't it? So there's a few things we can take away from this and conclude, if you like. Clearer understanding of injury risks at the collegiate female athlete level. So that is really important for us to understand, where do these injuries happen? What are the injuries? What's the frequency? What does it differ by playing level, time of the season, all that type of thing? And we can then put things in place to impact that. What can we impact? Well, there's contact versus non-contact. We can do more about non-contact injuries from a training perspective, from a physical sense, in terms of preparing the body for the contacts and the demands that the body is going to experience. whether that's interventions around ankle injury sprains, whether that's interventions around hamstring muscle strains, knee injuries, whether that's something like ACL prevention work, whether that's things like, preparing the adductor for the amount of loading the adductor is going to experience. These are all things which we can put huge focus on. And we've already seen that there's chronic injuries primarily, and non-contact represent around 40% of the injuries experienced. We can do a huge amount there. Things like contact injuries, like head and face contacts from a stick or a ball or another player, is a little bit more tricky to do things about from a physical perspective. It's not to say we can't do anything at all. And as I've said already, players who are more physically prepared in general will be at a lower risk of injury, but sometimes freak accidents, we can't necessarily prepare for, but we can certainly look to make a big impact on that non-contact side of things. In terms of program design, huge implications here, because if we know the types of injuries that occur, we can put a big emphasis on those areas. So if it's the ankle, well, I've made a video on this already, but essentially there's a few different areas which we can target with ankle injury prevention, things like proprioception around the ankle, the amount of strength that you can produce at the ankle joint, the range of motion of the ankle, and a variety of other factors. So we can then put interventions in place to hopefully reduce that risk of injury, keep track of the injury risks and the occurrence of injuries, and hopefully see that decline over time. And then obviously we already know that the higher level you play, the higher the demands are, so the more physically prepared you also are going to need to be, despite there being a reduction in the risk of injury on this injury surveillance program. That's largely because typically players are more prepared for those demands anyway, and the kind of non-contact and contact injuries can sometimes be reduced because of those factors. So in conclusion, it gives really valuable insight. It's going to help shape injury prevention strategy when you are working in this level. And it's really clear where we can make an impact. We can specifically target some of these key areas. So I hope that's been useful overview of the injury rates at the NCAA injury surveillance program and a female athlete level in particular. If you're interested and want to find out more about this kind of area, I'll be doing more of these types of videos in the coming weeks. So please hit subscribe, and I will look forward to seeing you soon.